Welcome to Transcendent. I'm Joe and I'm the dad.
And I'm Raya and I'm the daughter.
Last week I went to the clinic, walked in and I said, I'd like to see a doctor.
Really? Which doctor?
No, a medical doctor. Back when you were a kid, you'd be down in the basement with your friends and I'd say, what are you doing? And you'd say, oh, well, Bobby's making a guy. I never knew what that meant. One of the things that consumed so much of your free time was role-playing games. You would get together with sometimes just one of your friends, sometimes 2 or 3 or 4, probably from 5th or 6th grade on.
Yes. Yeah. Back in the mid-'80s.
Yeah, and that's never stopped. You're still into role-playing games, am I right?
In fact, more than I was probably as a child. And I've discovered that there's actually a very, very large population of LGBTQ people that play role-playing games. Did you know that this is now the 50th year of Dungeons & Dragons, which is kind of the flagship role-playing game?
So was that the very first one? Or
It is also the first one.
Oh.
So it started originally in the Twin Cities. A guy by the name of Dave Arneson got together with some friends that they would play little simulated battles. And they'd have troops out on the tables and they'd all get together at the University of Minnesota.
Oh.
One time they thought, let's try this. But instead of playing a whole battalion or the whole group of people, you only play one single character. And that actually became the beginning of role-playing. Another set of rules had recently been published near Milwaukee out of Lake Geneva by Gary Gygax, who had published a series of rules for battles in a fantasy setting. And at the very end, he put in some things. What if you wanted to do this as a Lord of the Rings style? What could you do if you had dragons or orcs or other fantasy creatures? And Dave Arneson got this idea. What if you took the battle part from this other game over here with the dragons and the orcs and combined it with the idea of you just play a single character? And he made a whole world where the people at his table got to come and be another person. From that, Dungeons & Dragons was born, and he got together then with Gary Gygax and said, hey, can we put this together as a game? And then they started to roll it out, and it became very, very popular.
Yes, and it's still popular today.
It's more popular now than it's ever been before. There's been a few things that have really helped it. The big one, of course, is a show that I'm sure you're very familiar with because I saw it at your house, Stranger Things.
Oh, yes.
You remember those boys were growing up in the 80s, the same time that I was growing up, and they were down in the basement, and they, of course, were playing Dungeons & Dragons, and then they name all of the villains in the show after their Dungeons & Dragons villains that they were fighting in the game.
So this was the beginning of an industry.
It very much was.
And
then a lot of other people realized we could do similar things, and then very quickly, in the late 70s and especially in the 80s when I started playing, there was a whole proliferation of games. There was a Robotech game and a Star Wars game and all kinds of other games, superhero games. And if you wanted to play science fiction or you wanted to play after the nuclear apocalypse or you wanted to play a cyberpunk game, all kinds of games. And at the core was always the same. It's a group of people sitting around a table. You play one character, and then one person is the game master. And that game master basically creates the whole world. Anyone that's not the game master is considered a player. And the game master says, this is the setting of the world here, and this is everything that's going on. What do you do? And then you say, okay, well, my character is this kind of person and so is going to act in such and such a way and is going to do this. And then the game master tells you, here's what happens. And different games will have different ways that they help the game master to figure it out. At the very easiest, you could actually have a game with no rules that the game master just makes it up on the fly. Well, here's what I think happens. But they discovered early on that it was more interesting if you brought some dice into it and you said, well, we don't know what happens. Let's go ahead and see. And we're going to set a difficulty at a certain number. And if you roll higher than that number, then you pass the test of whatever you're trying to do. And if you roll lower than that number, then you fail at that. And I'll tell you what happens when you fail, or I'll tell you what happens when you succeed.
Sounds complicated to me.
Well,
but
it's really not, because it's really a variation of what we do anytime we tell a story. It's really just improvisational storytelling with a little set of rules to help you know, here are some things you might want to do as you're improving.
It seemed to me it wasn't Dungeons and Dragons that you played so much. For me, I remember you speaking mostly about Car Wars.
And Car Wars was not so much a role-playing game as it was sort of going back to combat simulation. And it was the idea with this one, it's a not quite a post-apocalyptic world, but it's sort of a dark future where everybody is constantly fighting for their lives. And so people mount guns on their cars, and then you drive around and the bad guys are coming to get you. And so you have to shoot them. And so, yeah, it was the Car Wars. It was an interesting game. And in fact, those high school friends that I played with still like to get together and do these simulated battles between these cars.
Okay, so we know a little bit about this, and we know that you really got involved in it and that you still are, at 50 years old, involved in these games. How does this relate to our podcast, LGBTQ Situations?
Well, okay, first I would like to, just from a personal perspective, is to talk about the complicated relationship that I have with D&D, because in the 80s it was really perceived, much like it was shown in the Stranger Things show, to be something that nerdy boys would do. You would go down to the basement, and it was typically in a basement. Everywhere that we would go, we would end up playing in a basement somewhere. When we were growing up, it was in our basement. Occasionally, you could do the kitchen table, but you didn't like that as much because there were too many people around. So you would go get out of the way somewhere. But it was a way, I think, for nerdier kinds of boys in particular who maybe weren't as good out on the basketball court or didn't necessarily like playing football, that you could still be active. You could still have that fantasy of playing what it felt like to be a boy. And again, I'm speaking in very gendered terms here, because in those days, he really was very gendered. But it wasn't until I returned to D&D as an adult, and some of my friends continued to play, or at least continued to get things. They never really got out of it. But I had a whole period, probably 20 years, where I didn't really play at all. But I returned to it as an adult because I thought, first of all, this would be fun. I sure had a lot of fun as a child playing these games. And I imagine now as an adult, I could probably tell a lot more complicated stories, a lot more intricate, or things that have a lot more depth to them than I told as a child. I bet it would be a lot of fun. And so I got together with a few people and I said, would you be interested in playing? And this was at the time, really, right after I had just transitioned. And I was very surprised to discover the people at that time that were most interested in playing with me were not the kind of people that I expected. Because I grew up thinking this is nerdy boys that play in their parents' basement. But these were LGBTQ individuals that felt like they didn't fit in society, that felt like my role, I'd always been told I was supposed to be this feminine girl, but that never felt good to me. Or I always was told that I was supposed to be this kind of boy, but I've always found myself being a little more effeminate and attracted to boys. Or transgender people. I've never felt like I fit this role. we all are people that have felt like, I don't quite fit in. I don't match. This is the role that society has given me to play isn't the one for me. And so all of a sudden somebody hands you a toolkit and they say, you can be anyone that you would like to be. You can imagine yourself as an entirely different person. So imagine a book that you like to escape to, because in that book, you get to be somebody else and you get to go to an entirely different world. Except that in this world, this is now a game where together with your friends, you get to actually be that character. And you get to make the choices. It's like the ultimate choose your own adventure book, which we also grew up with. But in those times, you were limited on, you would read the page and you get to the bottom of the page and it says, if you want to go into the room, turn to page 64. If you turn and run away, turn to page 32. So they only give you two choices. But in a role-playing game, because there's a human arbiter of what's going on, a human behind the whole world, you can say, well, I don't want to go into the room, but I also don't want to turn and run away either. Is there a way that I can maybe slide a little tube under the door so I can hear better what's going on, and then I'm going to put my ear up to the tube and see what's going on behind that door? Or somebody else comes up with another idea that you've never thought of, and everybody says, whoa, that's a great idea. And now you've got the game master that's determining everything else in the world besides what the characters are doing, and thinks for a minute and says, yeah, okay, that seems like that would work, and looks down at their notes and says, okay, based on that, here's what's going to happen. So you're in the ultimate game of make-believe when you are somebody that's felt like, I've never fit in the world. And now you get to be that person that you've always wanted to be. You get to be, if you're a transgender guy, but maybe you're not out yet. You just know that you have not felt okay as a woman for whatever reason. I've just never quite fit here. And somebody says, you can play a strong, valiant paladin who fights for justice and for freedom and to help the oppressed. And you get to be somebody bringing justice in a way that makes you feel powerful and masculine in all of the ways that you've always dreamt of being. And it feels like, ooh, I really like this a lot.
I'm Chuck Reynolds, and I started listening to Transcendent because Joe is my friend. I keep listening because I have friends, colleagues, and family members who are part of the LGBTQ community, and I want to better understand their struggles and perspectives. I have become a supporter because I believe Joe and Raya are truly helping to preserve relationships and save lives. Join me in supporting Transcendent. Just go to transcendent.com, click on support, and select the amount you'd like to give each month. It can be as little as $3, and you can cancel at any time.
When I was young, we didn't have anything like that. But what the nerdy guys did, which was me, people were raising tropical fish. And it started because Winston Churchill liked tropical fish.
Really?
And I was all into tropical fish, and I raised them. I would breed them. I'd give them dinner first. But I would raise these, and I would trade with other people. And at one point, I could have considered selling the fish, but I didn't. But that was a big deal. Then a little later on, after I got to, at one point, I had 3 different aquariums, and I would change the water and do all that stuff. It was a lot of work, but I was sort of like controlling their world. And it was a little bit like that. And then the other thing, as I got older, I discovered that there were a lot of other nerdy kids like me who started collecting coins.
Oh, sure.
And that was really popular. a company called Whitman Publishing came out with these coin books, and they had all of the different types of coins. You could collect the pennies and you could put them in there. And they had pennies from 1940 up until 1959 in that. It was a 3-leaf book. And I would fill that, or I could do nickels, dimes, quarters, half dollars, silver dollars, all kinds of things. But in that, the reason I got started was that I had a lot of change every week because I was a paper boy, and they would pay me 35 cents a week. Unless they took a special thing, then they paid me 50 cents a week.
Sure.
But I had a lot. I'd come home with pockets full of change. I had very few paper bills. And I got so excited about it that what I would do is I would go downtown. I would take my pennies and wrap them up in a roll of 50. And I'd go into the bank and I'd trade it for a different roll that somebody else brought in. And then I'd go through that and see if I could find any great.
Oh, sure.
And I did that for probably 4 or 5 years. And I would trade coins with other people too. So it became one of those things. I would say, what were the nerdy guys doing then? They, instead of role playing, they were doing tropical fish
Sure.
or coin collecting.
Sure.
There might have been some people who also were into stamp collecting, but it wasn't as popular.
And I imagine comic books probably were.
Oh, yes.
Back then, sure. Yeah.
Oh, sure. And comic books are
Yeah.
still pretty popular.
Yeah. And I think all of those are kind of forms of escape from the world. It's a way to play.
Yep.
And we all need those ways to play. It's really, really important for us. We're wired as humans that we need to play.
Let me go back to a little bit earlier than that. Before you started role-playing games, or when there weren't any or you hadn't discovered them, when you were very young, you used to bring your pieces into the living room and set them up. You had a farm and you had a couple of other things.
Sure.
And
it was
you
those
said,
Fisher-Price Little People.
Yes.
I remember those very well.
And that was your world.
And it was really important because you would set up the whole society, and this was in proximity to this one, and so then these people could kind of be friends. And obviously I was very young. It wasn't super complicated, but it was a sense of gaining mastery over the world. It was a way to play, and that's a lot of what we do in play. And when you're talking about LGBTQ plus people, we are looking for ways to play. Maybe we don't even realize it. We as humans are always looking for ways to play. But then for us in particular, we're looking for ways that then feel affirmative, that feel like, wow, that just feels good to me. And it was always a sense for me that having a sense of this is the world and this is the story that I get to tell was always something that I connected with. Dungeons and Dragons played a really interesting role for me in that before I transitioned, right up until as an adult, when I finally came to terms with me in midlife, I worked very, very hard to make sure that I was doing things that were sufficiently masculine. I was always looking to make sure that I wasn't tipping the scales because people might know then. And I knew I had a secret, and I better not let that secret out. And also, if I ever let myself do things that were too feminine, then who knew where that would lead? You know, once you took that first step, it could very easily, I knew it could be a slippery slope. And all of a sudden, oh, wow, this feels too good to be who I am, and I don't want to turn back. And then, you know, that was really, really scary. So Dungeons and Dragons and any of those games that we were playing was really a way for me to both express something that was sufficiently masculine, but not too masculine. It didn't make me feel like I was having to actually be masculine. because I didn't like that. I didn't enjoy. I actually enjoy physical activity much more now after my transition because I feel more at home in my body. But at that time, I didn't feel at home in my body at all. And I remember when I tried to play basketball, they would pass me the ball and I couldn't catch it. It would go out of bounds just from passing me the ball. I was really uncoordinated and it didn't feel good, but I tried really hard and it never felt affirming to me. But when I would go to Dungeons and Dragons, it was a place where, okay, well, maybe I'm not all that coordinated, but my character is. And not only that, when I play Dungeons and Dragons, it's perceived by the people around me to be masculine enough that I'm not over the line. I'm not doing one of those girly things, and I'm going to end up getting myself into trouble. So it was a really safe place for me.
So were any of those people that you played with all those years, did any of those people come out as being different?
Of the people that I played with, I can't think of anyone that has. But I still get together to play with them now. And then one of them in particular has played when I started up a new group. I reached out to him and said, "Hey, do you want to join my group here?" And he said, "Sure." And he has since then played in any game that I've had open, especially through COVID. COVID, of course, when we were all on lockdown, that was really the way that I kept my social community because that was one game that we were able to take online. And I was able to play, so you would get into a Zoom meeting and then there was a tabletop it was a virtual tabletop. So we'd all log in. And I've continued with that. That's how I kept that community. But that group also then, I had other people. And in fact, one of the most, I think, to me, heartwarming stories is we had somebody at that table that identifies as non-binary. And they, during the course of that game, said, "I know you've all been using they, them pronouns for me because I don't feel like he or she quite fits for me. But I really feel like I want to go by a different name." And they switched their name at work, but our community was the very first place that they did that. And about a year later, somebody else at our table that I had no idea considered themselves on the LGBTQ spectrum said, "This feels like the safest place for me and I would like to come out to you all. I am non-binary and this is the name that I would like to use." And so we started using they, them pronouns for them as well. And it was really heartwarming to have this environment that felt safe enough.
Okay, let me take it to a different step here. You talked about these role-playing games, and we got a pretty good picture of what you're talking about, why you do it, and how it becomes a personification of something else. I get that. I talked about how I was handling tropical fish and about coin collecting and how I was controlling something else and being something else. But I'll tell you where it really made a difference to me to be something else. When I went to college, I was asked to try out for a play. Since then, I've been in 42 shows. And being in 42 shows, I get to be a different character. And I am telling you, if you've never been a character in a show, I am that person. When I'm in that character, I am that person. It's not like, oh, this is the line I have to think of. I'm living the life, which is really interesting.
Yeah,
I really feel it. I really feel when I was Sancho Panza to Don Quixote, I really felt that's who I was. I understood it. When Don Quixote had a line, and I was just on stage. It wasn't, oh, click, it's off, and now I'm back to being myself. No, I was there really listening, really reacting, not because I'm acting, but I'm reacting because I'm living the life. So I understand what you're saying about making those characters.
And of course, theater is well known for attracting LGBTQ individuals.
Absolutely.
For exactly that reason. It's a place that feels very safe and feels
Absolutely.
like I can be myself here. I can be someone different than me. I remember hearing a story actually about how the Beatles first created Sgt. Pepper's because they felt constrained that they always had to be who the Beatles were when they first came out. Those Beatles that were on Ed Sullivan and, you know, the Fab Four that all the girls were, you know, screaming for. And they felt like, well, we can't step out and do anything different. So the story that, as I know it, is they said, what if we imagine ourselves as another band? And so they created a whole persona band for themselves where they could write a different style of music. And it's really that era that thrust them into being what I think of as the Beatles, where they had their most creative songs. Up until then, they were a good band. But at that point, they really became a creative powerhouse that changed the music industry from then on. Taking on that persona allows you to be someone different that then you discover was really you all along.
Can you think of anything else that people will do that makes them feel as though they're stepping into another world? Is there something like that? Is there something that is more prevalent in the LGBTQ community?
I think video games have taken a big piece of that. I missed video games. That kind of came in after me, so I haven't connected with those. But I can tell you that for younger LGBTQ folks, there can be a strong pull towards someone who always thought or society thought was a cisgender man, and all of a sudden it becomes okay for him to play a female character in that video game. And then that starts to feel comfortable. And then all of a sudden she comes out that she wasn't who you thought that she was all to begin with. But that is beyond my expertise. And I'm sure there's others.
So what are you saying here? Are you saying that when we get involved in other things, that it's pushing us toward coming out, that it's telling us, look, here's something you didn't even know you were? Or is it something that is giving you a cover?
I think it's a little bit of each. And, we're motivated in such complicated ways that there are things that feel affirming to you or just feel fun, and you can't even necessarily describe what it is. So it's usually not even that thought through, but we all gravitate towards the things where we feel like we can be ourselves, and we feel like it allows us to not have to exercise the parts of ourselves that don't feel good. So I think we all do that. And I hope that a part of yourself that feels good is when you come here to this podcast every Monday morning and listen to things that affect the LGBTQ community. We're grateful to have you here as a listener. And this is a little different kind of podcast than we normally do, but always with the idea of improving our relationships and helping LGBTQ folks to be more and more themselves. Maybe this will inspire you to say, let me try out a role-playing game. I would like to try that for myself. Or to step out and try a new hobby that helps you feel more at home with who you are, whatever that is. We hope we've inspired you a little bit today.
And with that, we'll see you Monday.